Good afternoon, Hartford. Welcome again to the 7th episode of Voices of Veterans. We're going to be exploring still some of the psychology of what's been going on with veterans, but before we do that, we want to give our hope and blessing to people in Houston for what's happening to them there. And we know that the National Guard has been activated in Texas by the president to help out. And a point that should be brought up is that when Katrina happened in New Orleans back in 2005, half of the Louisiana National Guard had been deployed overseas to Iraq, and they couldn't be home where they're supposed to be to help out the people who live in their communities. So for the president to have activated, for the governor of the state of Texas to have activated the entire National Guard of Texas, probably he should have activated them before the hurricane hit, but at least now they're there and people are helping each other out. So we are, hopes and prayers are with Houston, and hopefully I know a lot of us are looking for ways to help them out as much as we can. And what's going to be going on, with a lot of veterans that are watching this, they're going to be reliving a lot of experiences. And so some of what we're going to be talking about today is the psychological have time. In fact, one of the books that I'm going to read to you from is called The Packing Inferno, The Unmaking of a Marine by Tyler E. Boudreau. And in this one particular chapter, he writes a chapter is called In Search of the Bad Guys. You've heard the cadences we sing, right? I said to a friend of mine, you've even heard this one. Then I shouted, because this was a shouting cadence and not a singing one. Your son is dead, shot in the head, right between the eyes with a 105. You should have seen his face all over the place. First one on your block to come home in a box. I used to love that ditty, I told him, and there's a whole lot more where that come from. You've heard them all before. He nodded. I've heard them. And that's what confounds me, I fulminated. Why, if everyone's heard them all before, why were we asking a bunch of guys who sing about mowing down children in schoolyards with M60s or getting their heads blown apart by 105 artillery rounds like it's a good thing? Why were we asking them to pack their guns to Iraq? Be men of the people and try to slap something together, some kind of stability. Why were we doing that? That's what I want to know. My heart pumps out a lot of rage since coming home from war, and I ride the rapid bloodstream, stay afloat. Sometimes I spew a head full of turmoil at the passing scenery and whatever passing people are in, and sometimes I manage a little stoicism, but I'm angry all the time. And what I found most frustrating, I don't know at whom exactly I should be angry. Who deserves all this loathing? Who are the bad guys? Bad guys anymore. I believe in survival now, but that doesn't make the rage subside. I'm reading about the war and I'm shaking the newspaper and I'm shouting like a lunatic. There are no good deeds in war. I don't even know who's saying that. I just say it like there's someone in the room listening. Somebody. It's a space inside me that I scream at when there's no one to scream at. And there's usually no one around to scream at. So I'm screaming a lot at myself. Don't you get it? You don't hand out a few pairs of shoes to the locals and then bomb a town and call it a good deed. You don't build a school and then kill a kid and expect his parents to call you benevolent. I kick a wall. I slam my fist down on a desk. I slump down into my chair like a melted candle, burnt out, and then I catch my breath and I look around the empty room and I still don't know who the bad guys are. A lot of people say to me, like, this is all in my head. Do I leap to rage? Sure. Am I disproportionately preoccupied with the war? Sure. Absolutely. Am I prone to talk about it for hours? Absolutely.
We'll be back in a couple of seconds.
Okay, we'll be back in 30 seconds. Okay, so a lot of veterans go through this, some people say to me, like this is all in my head. Do I leap to rage? Sure. Am I disproportionately preoccupied with the war? Absolutely. Am I prone to talk about it for hours into the night with a guest until he's drunk and half asleep on my couch, waiting for me to shut the hell up? Definitely. But there's a reason for the rage. It's not a disorder. I just want to know who the bad guys are. As a boy, it was always clear. We were always the good guys, and they were bad. We were the cops and the cowboys. We were the cavalry. We were the U.S. fucking Marines. We didn't always have a title, and we didn't always have a particular set of credentials. But of course, I know now, looking back, that we always had a particular look, and a particular sound, and a particular attitude towards those who didn't. And there were certain attributes, certain hues common to them as well. I get the principles of self and other now, but astonishingly, I still can't define it for my own sons. Their play is immersed in the theme of good guys and bad guys, and I play right along. I let them make their assumptions about good and evil. I help them make those assumptions. I place those assumptions in front of them on a silver platter. The stereotyping has already begun, and they're only in elementary school. They know their daddy was a Marine, and they believe I was a good guy. At least I hope they do. They know the colors of my uniform, of my flag, and of my skin. How do I extricate this truth from that? I look at my dress blues and all those shiny medals, and I look at all my dusty maps hauled back from the combat zone, and I look over my old desert boots, worn and sandy still, and I hold my sword gleaming silver, and still I can't put a steady finger on it. I let my boys hold my swords once. I've got two of them, one NCO sword and one officer sword. They loved it. They held them proudly like those swords were the embodiments of good itself. Their eyes were big and blue. Their smiles were priceless. It was a magical moment. Then I took the swords back to stow them away out of sight, but before I did, I caught a glimpse of my own eyes in the blade, and I said to myself, "Are you proud of this sword? Are you proud of yourself?" Sometimes it really is difficult to know. These swords do carry a magic in them, and it's potent. Even though today I'm not completely immune. But you can't have swords without bad guys. You can't have dress blues. You can't have valor. You can't have medals. You can't have sacrifice in battle. You can't have armies. You can't have patriotism. You can't have any of it without the bad guys. We know we need bad guys. The preservation of an age-old, time-honored, sacred institution depends on it. This institution is war. So who are the bad guys? We spent a good deal of time trying to work that out before they shipped over to Iraq. They were the Mujahideen. They were Al-Qaeda, the Islamic extremists, the Saddam loyalists, the foreign fighters, the criminals and the thugs, whatever. I don't know why we tried so hard to come up with a name. We should have done like the troops and just called them all Hajis. That's the way we treated them, the same, like their motives were irrelevant. It's not like we ever stopped to ask. A guy with a gun was a guy with a gun, and that made him an enemy. A bad guy by any other name is still a target. And you can see by the psychology and the pain that this former Marine is going through that this war, like all of our wars, is still with us. And one of the fundamental things that war does to you is it changes how you think about other human beings. And as a combat medic, that's what my job was. I had a very hard time distinguishing the people of Vietnam as the enemy because they were human beings just like us. And quite often, I would go out into the villas on what's known as a med cap. And what we would do is we would go out into the villages with our medical supplies. I would suture up wounds. I would treat wounds. We would treat people. We would pass out medications. We would pass out antibiotics. And these were some of the positive things that you would think that you would do in war. But at the same time, I was well aware of the fact that even though I was performing these aid things and these helpful things to people, we were also killing them. And we were killing them all the time. Not only with bombs and guns and weapons, but we were killing them with drugs, with Agent Orange, with chemicals, and all of this stuff was going on. As time went by, I came to understand that the war and who the bad guys really were was not clear. Were we the bad guys, or were we the good guys? And how important was that to to Americans? I think it's very important to Americans. So our history, which has become another issue that we're fighting over right now, the history of this country is being looked at in a much sharper way than it was when I was in school. When I was going to school and when Steve was going to school, we learned our history, and most of it was quite frankly pictured to make us look like the good guys. Always. Even during the Civil War, the Union was the good guys, the Confederacy were the bad guys. And how could they not be? They were slave owners, they were rebels, they were people who were about to destroy the Union. So today, that kind of history is buried, and people don't talk about Jim Crow laws. They don't talk about the Reconstruction and how it ended. And so for us to see what happened in Charlottesville is painful. And so here again, we're asking the question, who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? And what happens to the good guys when they finally realize they may not be so good? One of the terrible occurrences that came out of Vietnam was something that's with us today, even today with the war in Afghanistan, but is also with the whole country as a whole, and that's the addiction to opiates. What happened in Vietnam was not very well known to the American public until after a lot of us came home. But there was a terrible use of heroin among the United States Army in Vietnam and the troops in Vietnam. One of the books that I purchased for the library, that I was so glad to get, was called The Politics of Heroin, CI Complicity in the Global Drug Trade, written by Alfred W. McCoy. And this is the second revision because he carries this into Afghanistan. But I'm going to read briefly how this book got started so that you can have an understanding of where we are today and what's happening amongst the GIs returning from Afghanistan and still going on with the Vietnam veterans that are struggling with drug addiction even today. Writing this book has been a long journey from America to Asia, from youth to middle age. In 1970, then 25, and in my second year of Yale Graduate School, I set out on a voyage around the world to study the politics of the global heroin trade, particularly the covert alliances between drug lords and the intelligence agencies. Somehow, I survived the unanticipated adventures that followed, and 2 years later published The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, a book that was more expose than explanation. Over the next 15 years, I returned to Southeast Asia several times to research articles on the drug trade and to gather material for a second book entitled The Drug Traffic, a study of crime and corruption in Australia. Then in the mid-1990s, I began working on the revisions for this edition, focusing on the U.S. drug wars fought in the decades since The Politics of Heroin was first published in 1972. My work on the heroin trade began in the fall of 1970 as an outgrowth of an academic book that I had edited on Laotian politics. Elizabeth Jacob, an editor at Harper Row Publishers in New York, suggested that I use my knowledge of Southeast Asia to write a quick analysis of the history behind the heroin epidemic, then sweeping U.S. troops in South Vietnam. What began as a short book based on library research soon mushroomed into a much more ambitious project after 4 chance encounters in the first months of research. During the spring break of 1971, I took time off from research in Yale's Sterling Library to fly to Paris for interviews with French officers about the opium trade during the Indochina War of the early 1950s. With brashness beyond belief, I phoned the offices of a French aeronautics company for an interview with somebody named General Maurice Bellot. When I was ushered into an office with a panorama of a Parisian boulevard and Louis XVI furniture juxtaposed against helicopter photos, I realized that a French executive was sharing his time with an American graduate student. The general, it turned out, had once been head of a French espionage in Indochina. But the war was a long time ago, and he looked back with an academic dispassion to explain carefully and patiently how he had used the opium trade to finance his cash-strapped covert operations. His drug traffic had also stitched together an anti-communist coalition that ran from the Laotian Hill tribes to Saigon's politicians, police, and gangsters. What happened, I asked, to his apparatus after the French quit Saigon in 1955. The general said that your CIA had taken over the whole thing, drugs included. A trip to Saigon, he advised, would confirm this information. Another French veteran confirmed the general's information and his suggestion. As a career paratrooper, Colonel Roger Trinquier was part of a military generation that moved from defeat in Vietnam to the tortures of the dirty war in the Kasbah of Algiers to white mercenary armies in black Africa. The colonel invited me to his elegant apartment, decorated with Vietnamese porcelains and Chinese rosewood, where he explained in great detail how his command had expropriated the colonial opium monopoly in 1960 and used it 1950 and used it to finance covert operations among the hill tribes of Tonkin and Laos. His paratroopers collected the opium from the tribes, shipped it south to Saigon on a secret Air Force flights, and sold it through opium dens run by the Bin Zuyen bandits. This was the first time he had ever sat opposite a covert warrior. His will was overwhelming. As he leaned forward to make points quietly and precisely, he unleashed a surge of energy that seemed to strike me across the face. I emerged from his apartment more knowledgeable about opium than I could have imagined. But I was shaken, intimidated, drained of energy. Looking back, I had crossed from the politis of the academy into a world of covert warfare with unlimited cruelty and untrammeled will. And as I read this book, and I began to realize there was a continuous overlap between who the good guys and the bad guys were. There was nobody who was considered to be just the good. The bad and the good were constantly intermixing. A few weeks later, I was back in New Haven at a street demonstration for Black Panther leader Bobby Seale, where I met the Beat Generation poet Allen Ginsberg. Over coffee at the bus station, he spun out a dark poetic vision of CIA involvement in the Southeast Asian heroin trade, one that he recorded a few months later in a wryly angry poem, CIA Dope Calypso, and one that anthologists have since excised from his corpus. I'm going to read this poem by Allen Ginsberg. To be Li Fong, he worked for the French, a big fat man who liked to dine and wench. Prince of the Mios, he grew black mud till opium flowed through the land like a flood. Communists came and chased the French away, so Tubi took a job with the CIA. And his best friend, General Vang Pao, ran the Mio army like a sacred cow. Helicopter smugglers filled Long Cheng's bars in the Xinjiang province on the Plain of Jars. It started in secret. They were fighting yesterday, clandestine secret army of the CIA. All through the 60s, the dope flew free through Tan Son Nhut, Saigon to Marshall Key. Air America followed through, transporting confiture for President Thieu. All these dealers were decades and yesterday the Indo-Chinese mob of the U.S. CIA. To ground these imaginings in fact, Ginsberg later mailed me a carton stuffed with years of unpublished time-of-life dispatches that he had purloined from their files, documenting the involvement of America's allies in the Asian opium traffic. The last chance encounter was the most unlikely of all. At a society wedding in New York City for the sister of a Columbia fraternity brother, I was astonished to hear a group of Marine officers, guests of the groom, tell stories of North Vietnamese soldiers found dead with syringes in their arms on the slopes of Khe Sanh, of communist truck convoys rolling down the Ho Chi Minh Trail loaded with heroin for GIs. By now, I had questions the millions of books in Yale's Sterling Library could not answer. As you can see, the line between good and bad is becoming even more blurred. After crisscrossing the country on 707s, I landed in San Francisco for a stay with the poet and Berkeley professor Peter Dale Scott. He put me in touch with an ex-Green Beret just back from covert operations in Laos, who told me over the phone of seeing CIA aircraft loading opium. He agreed to be interviewed on the record. The next morning, we knocked at his door in an East Palo Alto apartment complex. We never got inside. He was visibly upset, saying he had gotten the message. I said, "What happened?" "Follow me," he said, leading me across the parking lot to his MG sports car. He pointed at something on the passenger door and named a chemical explosive that could melt a hole in sheet metal. It was, he said, a signal to shut up. I looked but could not recall seeing. The next day I flew to Los Angeles, visited my mother, and then flew on to Saigon, forgetting the incident. I refused to recognize the reality of this threat until 20 years later I came across a passage in Professor Scott's poem, Coming to Jakarta. Inconsiderable death threats, but that clean morning in Palo Alto, the former Green Beret, who just the night before had said he would talk to us about opium in Laos, showing us the sharp black hole in the MG's red steel door, the floorboards hardly scorched, and saying that hot and imploded thermal charge must have come from my old unit. And if from such terror we each acknowledge we are not normal in this world where we live by forgetting. In some respects, the bad guys do become the good guys after a while, because as time has gone by, men have revealed what has happened in Vietnam. When I came home in August of 1971, after a year in Vietnam, there were uncounted GIs, including many in the medical corps, who were addicted to or using heroin in its various forms. And we told them when we came home that they were shipping this heroin back inside the coffins of dead GIs. And no one believed the story. How is it that 30, 40 years after the war is ended, a film is made called The American Gangster by Denzel Moore about the heroin being shipped home inside the coffins of dead GIs? This was one of the ways that Americans became involved, and a lot of good Americans became involved in the bad drug trade that was flowing from overseas. There was a huge upshot in heroin addiction among Americans and soldiers coming home, and also in American cities across the land. And I think it would behoove the present government to pay attention to what's happening in Afghanistan, because it's my understanding that there are Afghan vets coming home from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq who are ending up on methadone programs and Suboxone programs. The VA itself has its own programs to help drug addiction, because they can see the amount of people that are coming home addicted to heroin. And now that opiate addiction has become such an overwhelming problem in a lot of areas in the United States, particularly West Virginia, Indiana, Illinois, all across the country, it would behoove us to pay attention to what's happening in these countries. Some of this is ancient history. I would think that you should